Welcome to tonight's meeting of the Exeter Historical Society. Before we begin, tonight's program takes place in Misquamscook, now called Exeter, in Nadakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the Alnabak, the people, who have stewarded Nadakina and its Aki, Nibi, Olaquakak, and Oasak, the land, the waterways, the flora, and the fauna throughout the generations. And now I'll turn you over to Laura Martin.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm going to once again thank you for joining us tonight, not only for our program, but for our annual meeting. This program is made possible by the New Hampshire Humanities, and you can learn more about that at nhhumanities.org. So I have just a few announcements. At the end of tonight's program, we ask that you take a few moments to complete the Humanities to Go survey, which you probably found on your seat. These evaluations help to ensure New Hampshire Humanities has the feedback necessary to continue to provide and support programming like this. And if you are joining us on Zoom, you should receive an online survey at the very end. Also tonight, as I've already mentioned, we will hold our annual business meeting immediately following the program. Whether you are with us in person or online, we ask that if you are a member of the society, you stay through the brief meeting so that we will have a quorum. We are quite literally counting on you. If you are on Zoom and you are a member, we would like you to hold tight for a couple of moments because it will move away from the program, probably to a video, and then it will come back to the annual meeting. So please just hang in there. We'd also like to thank Exeter TV for bringing all of our programs to our members and friends virtually. They are making it possible for us to reach a much larger audience, and we truly appreciate it. Check out our website, exeterhistory.org, for more information about our events and for more Exeter history. Tonight, if you'd like to ask a question and you're here in person, please raise your hand and wait for one of us to come to you with a microphone. Not only will it help our speaker hear you, but it will allow those who are watching online to hear you as well. If you are on Zoom or Facebook and you have a question, please put your question in the comments section and we'll try our best to ask it on your behalf. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Tonight we will be hearing from Jane O'Neill, the founder of Culturally Curious, an arts education consulting firm specializing in art appreciation programs. She curates and delivers programs throughout New England and beyond. She holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. Born and raised in New Hampshire, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. Welcome, Jane.
All right, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Okay, that's a good start. Thanks for joining us tonight. It is an honor and a privilege for me to be here, and I'd like to echo the thanks to New Hampshire Humanities for helping to present tonight's program. So with all of my programs that I offer through New Hampshire Humanities and through my company, I always say that they're ever changing, ever evolving because of audience participation. So if you see something you'd like to comment on by the end of the night, or you have a question, believe it or not, it might become part of the program. So I'm relying on you for additional insight. I think anything that I share with you tonight when it comes to Norman Rockwell is maybe an idea that you would have come to on your own had you had enough time to look at these images, but I'll be sharing my insight with you along the way, and I have no doubt that you will have insight to share as well. So we've got this great image on the screen. We will be getting back to it, but I thought, let's see if we're just moving forward. Oh, we already have a technical issue. The clicker is not working. Sorry. Maybe we could swap that out for another one. I have one in my bag. Doesn't matter. All right, we already have a hero for tonight. Thank you. All right, let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend this hour together. We're going to get started with a very brief introduction to Norman Rockwell. I assume you know a little bit about him, and that's why you're here tonight. And then we're going to take a little bit of a left turn and consider what war looked like in American art prior to Norman Rockwell, to get a sense in terms of what he was leaping from when he started to make these images of World War II. And then we've got a little bit of a prequel, some of his images from World War I. We're just going to take a quick glance at that. Then we'll delve into a series that he did called Willie Gillis, and then the Four Freedoms, which I know most people know and love. Then we'll turn our attention to some heroes at home and what he does so very well, the homecomings, and wrap up. All right, so plenty to cover here. Let's get started with Norman Rockwell himself. Here we see him looking out at us while he's working on one of his paintings, and he's got one of those sort of coy little smiles on his face because, you know, he had a great sense of humor, and it came out so well in so many of his paintings. So if we're just looking at some basic information here, Norman Rockwell was born just before the turn of the 20th century, and then he died in the era of disco. We often refer to him as being America's most beloved illustrator, and that's sort of like a fine line that doesn't mean much to many people, because he was an illustrator, but he was also a fine art artist in that he was painting finished oil paintings. He had the same training as any artist who might have paintings in an art museum or in a commercial gallery, but he was producing these oil paintings for commercial purposes. We know him best probably for his 47-year relationship with the Saturday Evening Post, but the entire time he was working for them, he was also producing cards, calendars, other designs for other customers. And we associate him with the very definition of American life. He reflected it, and he helped to define it. And so often we see these patriotic themes coming through in his works of art. I wanted to share with you, this is a self-portrait of the artist. He's standing at the easel here with his maul stick, and he's surrounded by Boy Scouts. He actually had a 64-year-long relationship with the Boy Scouts of America, where he was producing calendars for them. These Boy Scouts seem relatively unimpressed with Norman Rockwell here, but he would make some really impressive paintings that were really meant to conjure patriotic feelings. These two young scouts here looking over their shoulders at a vision of George Washington genuflecting with his horse behind him and his sword at his feet. Norman Rockwell also painted portraits of presidents. The Saturday Evening Post asked that a lot of him towards the end of his career. He didn't necessarily like doing it, but he did paint presidents on both sides of the aisle, and he got along with everybody, but he did admit that it was hard to make Richard Nixon look likable. That was a challenge. And then continuing on with patriotic themes, Norman Rockwell was such an institution that by the country's bicentennial, he's asked to paint a self-portrait for the cover of American Artist magazine. This was their July 4th cover. And he's getting on in years. This is just 2 years before he dies. So you can see that his ability to render that fine detail has sort of diminished here. But he paints himself alongside another American icon, the Liberty Bell. And it's, I mean, what a smart thing to do, because it's on a human scale. They're kind of wonderfully matched that way as he drapes the Happy Birthday banner on the bell itself. So the following year, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Gerald Ford. Here he is back in his studio in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, checking out, assessing that award. And then, of course, he would pass away the following year. So what a distinguished career he led, and obviously an outsized influence, because here we are today still thinking about his artwork. Now, we'll get back to him in just a moment, but I have just the briefest overview of what war has looked like in American art prior to Norman Rockwell, because we know this is a major subject for him for both World War I and World War II. So what was he leaping from? What was he responding responding to, what came before him. So in the briefest terms, we're looking at here a picture of the Battle of Bunker Hill, painted by the American artist John Trumbull. And he would know a thing or two about this battle because he was actually there as George Washington's aide de camp. So he witnessed all of it. And we tend to look at a picture like this as almost gospel. You know, this is the literal truth of what the Battle of Bunker Hill looked like. When in fact, John Trumbull painted this 11 years later, and he relied very heavily on artistic conventions in order to create this composition. So, most notably here, we have the death of General Warren, who is collapsed on the ground and sort of being propped up from behind, very similar to images of Christ's death, too. So even though you have all of the chaos of war here, we've got, you know, the winners, the losers, the martyrs here, all of it is somewhat formulaic, not as inspired by true events as you might assume. So if we're zooming along through history, we're going to move right up to the Civil War here. And I've got two images that were created by America's favorite artist of the 19th century. That's Winslow Homer. So Winslow Homer was at the front. He was watching this war unfold, and he would create these sketches and then send them back for publication for the entire country, really, to consume these images. Now they're black and white, and in this case, with the cavalry charge over here on the left, it's really hard to see who are the winners, who are the losers, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. Instead, you just get the chaos of it and how scary that chaos is. He was also able to convey a real sense of fear and dread with this image over here. There's a finished painting inspired by this print, and it's called The Sharpshooter. And the idea that somebody could be hidden up in a tree with a rifle that could shoot someone from 500 feet away was just terrifying, when the notion of war was two armies facing each other and kind of marching towards each other. So this was seen as a somewhat dishonorable, if not terrifying, new innovation in warfare. Now, during the Civil War, we also had photography, and we tend to take these images as literal truth as well. This is Timothy O'Sullivan's photograph called The Harvest of Death at Gettysburg, when in fact many Civil War photographers would actually drag bodies around to change a composition or to make a more compelling composition for their viewers. So obviously there were bodies on the ground at Gettysburg, but we know that the landscape and the arrangement of these bodies were altered by these photographers. Now, if we move right along, right up to World War I have an image here for you from the American artist John Singer Sargent. And this is a massive painting that he was commissioned to do. It's about 20 feet long, and it's called Gassed. This is an image about chemical warfare now. So warfare has dramatically changed at this point. And all of these figures here have been blinded by the use of mustard gas. So you can see many of them have blindfolds on. It's literally a column of soldiers. It's the blind leading the blind here. And you can see these guide wires over here that they're leading each other towards a medical tent where they're going to get some assistance. But we also see that there's just bodies in the foreground, bodies in the background. All of these people, all of these men's lives forever change because of the use of this chemical here. So John Singer Sargent not focusing on winners, losers, but instead the human toll of this kind of warfare. So now let's turn our attention to Norman Rockwell, because he also takes up the subject of World War I before he gets to World War II. And so we're just going to look at just a few images that he painted right around the same time that John Singer Sargent is thinking about mustard gas and and these blinded soldiers. How does Norman Rockwell respond? Well, first and foremost, Norman Rockwell wanted to join the fray. He wanted to join the Navy, but he was such a tall, skinny beanpole of a man that he didn't actually make weight. And apparently, the story is that he just went home and ate a lot of bananas and milkshakes, and then went back and reweighed the next day, and was able to join the Navy. But he never saw any battle. He stayed here in America, and he was primarily just used as an artist, which would be the highest and best use of his skills. So during World War I, he was creating images like this one. So what are we looking at here? We see a soldier who's looking out directly at us. And I also want to draw attention to the fact that he's smiling and we can see his teeth, which you don't often see in the history of art. This is a very happy man. Notice he is sitting in the wind-driven snow here with the sarcastic sign, Hotel Ritz, and he's opened up a care package, right? So we can see actually even his name, Sammy Smith. We can see the holly berries there, so it's a Christmas care package. And he is taking all of these items out of the box. There's, a baseball, there's books, there's cigarettes, but what he's happiest about in this moment are the warm socks and the scarf, right? And it kind of takes us all back to, the first times that we've been away from home and getting that care package. Norman Rockwell called this, "They remembered me." And so not only do we think of our own experiences being away from home, but we instantly connect with this young man. It's a heartwarming image. It's a world away from painting battle scenes, right? Norman Rockwell wants us to think of American soldiers on an individual basis and to stay connected to who they are as husbands, brothers, uncles, fathers, that sort of thing. So just a couple more images from World War I. This is an Easter cover that he created. I believe this was for the Saturday Evening Post. What a compelling image. What we're looking at here is just the suggestion of the debris, the rubble, the destruction of something. And from that debris, we have these beautiful yellow tulips springing forth. This is the resurrection, right? This is the Easter cover. And Norman Rockwell paints this young man tenderly watering those tulips with water from using his own helmet as like a watering can here. So he's nourishing that life. Notice there's just a very subtle detail. I mean, he's against this white background, but you can see there's a little bit of orange on his shoulder and on the side of his face. So maybe there's a fire over there. Maybe it's actually the burning rubble of something. And in that moment, he's still inspired to pause and to encourage the life of these beautiful flowers here. So once again, the humanity, the compassion of this soldier instead of, a fierce warrior, what have you. So one last World War I image for you. This is at the end of the war, and we can see a very proud soldier who's returned home. He's a decorated soldier. He's got 3 ribbons across his chest, and he's walking so upright, his chin held high. And we can see that the neighborhood kids are all looking up to him. They're delighted that he's home. They want to be like him. This is a little improvised war medal on this little guy here who happens to be wearing a bucket on his head so that he can be like the soldier here. So once again, a hero that we can look up to. Every one of us can look at an image like this and remember what it's like to be a child or what it's like to look up to somebody older, somebody who seems heroic. This man and these boys are supposed to remind us of our own loved ones. Now, we're going to switch gears, and I want to show you the first image we'll look at, that's a World War II image. And it's this one here. So right off the bat, you can see that there is a lot more detail. Not only has Norman Rockwell's ability to render style come a very long way since World War I, but printing printing publication technology has come quite a long way as well. So the emphasis here is on the details. And what we're looking at here is a young American soldier who is with a little girl who appears to be like a refugee. Her feet are bare. She's got these little pigtails, but they're a little bit ratty looking. She looks like she's been through something. So this soldier has put down his weapon. We can see it there in the foreground. And he is giving her his food. He's actually feeding her, and she's definitely old enough to feed herself. But he recognizes that this is a little girl who needs this kind of tenderness. Look at the expression on his face. I was just asking my 9-year-old son, who does he look like? And my son said, he looks like a dad. And so, and that is exactly what Norman Rockwell was trying to get across with an image like this. He called this one the American way. So if you're an American who's sitting at home, you're worried about the war, and you get a magazine cover with the American way on the front, with this image on the front of that magazine, you begin to feel very positive feelings about these soldiers and about what the entire country is doing in terms of this war. So let's turn our attention fully to World War II now. And I want to share with you a series that Norman Rockwell did on a character named Willie Gillis. Is anybody here familiar with the Willie Gillis images? They're really not that well known for the most part. So Norman Rockwell wanted to tell the story of World War II, but once again, he was in this pickle. He was stuck here in America. He wasn't serving abroad. He wasn't embedded with any troops. So how do you tell that story? Well, Norman Rockwell knew that he wanted to share the perspective of a soldier, and that he wanted that soldier to be like a pipsqueak, a runt, an underdog that we could all cheer for. So Rockwell was actually living in Vermont at the time, and he went to a square dance, and he saw this little guy named Otis Buck, who was probably like 5'2", and thought, that's my guy. This is going to be my model. And so you can see here, this is Otis Buck, who Norman Rockwell calls Willie Gillis, and he looks like a 12-year-old compared to the other soldiers there, right? This is just a scene where we can see them riding in the back of a truck, but we can sort of chart the course of Willie Gillis's experience in the service. So he goes to basic training prior to Pearl Harbor, and we can see what happens when he's at basic training. Well, first of all, I want to draw your attention to the incredible detail that Rockwell has used to paint this. Like you can really see the different textures of these different fabrics here. It's outstanding. So Willie Gillis is our little guy in the front, and if you've got good eyes, you can probably see that he's got a package here that's labeled food, no delay. And so here he is carrying his care package with food. We go back to the care package, and all of these men who are much bigger than him, some of them with fists clenched, are walking right up behind him, sort of fanning out behind him, very determined to get that food from Willie Gillis. And Willie Gillis knows that it's not going to be his for very long. And little things like this arched eyebrow that we see with Willie Gillis there, these are directorial moves on the part of Norman Rockwell. He knew just how he wanted his characters to express feeling and emotion or create comedy in his images. So he would coach his actor or his model in this way. This next image here is right after basic training. Willie Gillis gets to come home. And once again, Norman Rockwell is tapping into universal experiences for all of us. We've all had the experience of being away from home for some time and then crawling back into your own bed, and there's nothing so good as that, right? So in this case, he's peeled off his socks and his shoes, his uniform. He's gotten back into this bed with, this handmade quilt here, sleeping under a sign that says "Home Sweet Home." Now, Now, over here, we've got a clock by the bedside table. It's about 10 o'clock, and it's the morning. You can just see that faint light coming in on the left-hand side. And even though you can't see Willie Gillis's mouth in this picture, you're almost certain that he's smiling. Like, this is contentment, being back in your own bed and being able to sleep in. Norman Rockwell knows just how to characterize these moments. Now, the other thing to notice in this picture is that it's November 29th, 1941. So it's about a week before Pearl Harbor, and so everything's about to change, right? So Willie Gillis is on active duty, but Norman Rockwell is not going to show him in battle. Instead, he's going to be doing these underdog things. For anybody, what I've been told over the years from people that serve, this is like the most dreaded assignment for most men in the military. This is KP. Here he is peeling a big bin of apples, but he's been distracted by another care package, in this case, letters from home and the hometown news. So he is reading the annotated hometown news with things underlined and little commentary from home. Look at that eyebrow again. That's Norman Rockwell injecting a little bit of humor into this scene. Now, interestingly, there were still challenges with media literacy, even back in the 1940s. And as it turned out, there were huge swaths of the American public that didn't realize that Willie Gillis was just an invented character. And they all began to worry about him. They actually wrote to the Saturday Evening Post and they said, "Is he okay? Can you tell us what's happening with Willie Gillis?" They thought he was a real soldier who was in harm's way. So Norman Rockwell continues on with the trials and tribulations of Willie Gillis. And in this case, he's getting some attention from the girls in the USO. They create this nice kind of triangle around his face. He's looking out directly at us, bug-eyed, cheeks bulging. His cup literally runneth over here. It's like you almost get the sense this is the first time he's ever had female attention. So the food is kind of falling off of his lap. His spoon is falling off of his lap. And Norman Rockwell, importantly, makes him pigeon-toed. And that emphasizes to us that he's a young guy. He's inexperienced. He might as well be a child in this situation, but he is absolutely loving every minute of it. Norman Rockwell kind of speeds things up for Willie Gillis, gets him a little bit more comfortable with the ladies with this cover from 1942, where it's almost all black, but we see Willie Gillis's face here, and he's holding a pamphlet that says what to do in a blackout. He's got a female companion here who is reading the pamphlet over his shoulder. He's not reading it, he's eyeing her. He knows exactly what to do in a blackout, right? But all sorts of wonderful details here. Notice the feather in her cap and how her fingers sort of spread out like that feather on his shoulder. So now Willie Gillis is growing up a little bit, and it's like all of the country got to share in this with him. And then something horrible happens for Norman Rockwell. Willie Gillis actually does enlist, and he loses his model. So then he has to think about, how do you tell the story of Willie Gillis without being able to picture Willie Gillis? So this one is called Double Trouble, Willie Gillis. And we see two women here, neighbors, because we've got our two mailboxes, and they're both out tending their Liberty Gardens. They get their mail, and they both have pictures of Willie Gillis in their letters, so they are fighting with each other. Who gets Willie? And I like to think of myself as a good student of body language here, and I would say that the blonde is dominating, right? She is in that redhead space, but the redhead is stubborn, and I'll tell you, Norman Rockwell never saw a redhead he didn't want to paint. So in the end, our redhead wins out. Interestingly, these two women were friends of Norman Rockwell. They were daughters of another illustrator. You can see them at the top of this composition right next to Norman Rockwell, the blonde and the redhead there. But Norman Rockwell lets our redhead win, and in this next cover related to Willie Gillis, we can see the redhead on New Year's Eve, fast asleep in her bed, even though it's midnight. She's got these goofy pictures that I'm sure that were studies by Norman Rockwell of his model there that frame her bed, and we can see that she fell asleep reading letters from her honey. So it shows her devotion to this young man and her willingness to give up on New Year's Eve fun. And of course, showing her from this perspective is a nice kind of closed parentheses to the home sweet home that we saw before. So the war ends, and Norman Rockwell gets the chance to close parentheses on Willie Gillis. And so how does he decide to do that? He decides to show Willie Gillis taking advantage of veterans' benefits. And in this case, he's going to college and receiving his education. So if you're familiar with the university, Middlebury College, I guess that is the cupola of the church there. And he's sitting in his dorm room with his books, with elements that remind us of his service, but with the pipe and the golf clubs that sort of show that he has he's fully realized sort of his potential at this point in his life, and is going forward with his education and with leisure, and everything's working out for Willie Gillis just perfectly here. So Rockwell gives us a nice ending for this young character. Let's switch gears here and look at a series that I'm sure everybody here has heard of before, and that's The Four Freedoms, of course. And these are those four images. Norman Rockwell was galvanized by a speech by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It was his State of the Union in 1941, when Roosevelt talked about these four rights that he felt like everyone on the planet was entitled to: the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. And Norman Rockwell just knew that he had to do something with those four freedoms. And he struggled with this. This is a man who could churn out a very detailed cover for the Saturday Evening Post essentially on a monthly basis. But it took him the better part of 7 months to create this series, and he lost 15 pounds in the process. So he struggled over this, and they didn't quite know what to do with it. He was offering up his services to the government. They didn't quite know how to use it. So in the end, these images were in the Saturday Evening Post, but they were also part of a touring exhibition that ultimately helped to raise, this is hard to wrap your head around, $132 million for the U.S. Treasury in the midst of World War II. If that's not the most patriotic thing you've ever heard, I don't know what is. So let's drill down on these four freedoms and just note for ourselves how difficult it would be to imagine creating these images. I mean, if somebody handed you a pencil and said, draw me freedom from fear, where would you even begin? And Rockwell wants to tell a story. He wants to make these relatable. So let's see how he got there. So with freedom of speech, he was inspired by a town meeting that he went to out in Vermont. And one of the things that had happened there was that somebody stood up with a really unpopular opinion at this town meeting, and yet the community members gave him the floor, and they listened to him respectfully. And for Rockwell, that was what represented the freedom of speech, being respectful in your discourse. Notice this is a little Rockwell self-portrait right there. That's his eyeball at the top of the picture. So the other thing to notice is that our speaker here is dressed in sort of working class clothes, maybe even dirty clothes. And most of the other gentlemen here are wearing jackets and ties. So he is an outsider from the get-go, but Rockwell sets him apart by the fact that he's standing, by the fact that he is in front of this black background, and he makes him almost like a visionary as he's speaking here. So even we respect him, I think, impulsively as we look at this work. Now, I want to share with you an earlier sketch that Rockwell made of the freedom of speech, and you can see how, compared to the final work, this is nowhere near as successful, but you can kind of see him working through his ideas. He's got his working class speaker, but notice his mouth isn't even open. But notice how the other members of the community seem so suspicious of him. Nobody really seems like they want to listen to him. And he kind of blends in with the crowd here too, because he's just one of many. And Rockwell sort of fixed all of that for the final work. Now, a lot of people think that his speaker, as he painted it, looks a lot like Abraham Lincoln. That's probably not an accident, because Norman Rockwell loved Abraham Lincoln. He painted him at least 8 different times. This is a version of Lincoln where he talked about shooting him from below and exalting his figure, making them look more important. And he sort of does that with his speaker in the freedom of speech. All right, let's turn our attention back here to the series for just a moment. And as we turn our attention to the freedom of religion, notice that it looks so different from the other images. The other images are a nice little vignette. They tell a story. They're relatable characters. And these are just giant heads, really, heads and hands, all bent in prayer. Rockwell had come up with an idea for how he wanted to portray freedom of religion. And it was a barbershop scene where we have like our Catholic priest, and maybe this is a Protestant, and this was supposed to be a Jewish man who was getting a shave. And importantly for Rockwell too, there was a black man who was going to be entering the barbershop. In the end, he felt like he was relying too heavily on stereotypes, so he just gave this up. And he went for the big heads and the big hands here, which is also really compelling. And he was also very mindful to include people of different backgrounds, different ethnicities, because the whole point is you might not be worshiping the same God, but we're all sort of pointing in the same direction here. Now, our next image is the reason why, I blame this image on all of our present day overeating at Thanksgiving these days. This is like the ultimate image of Thanksgiving, the freedom from want. So fresh off of the Great Depression, Norman Rockwell gives us this middle-class American fantasy of this pristine house with the white tablecloth and the white curtains and the white woodwork here. There, our matriarch and our patriarch kind of presenting this turkey to this multi-generational meal. And notice, nobody's really looking at the turkey. There's like one really hungry guy here, but the rest of them, they're all looking at each other. They're enjoying each other's company because nobody here is starving. A really important detail here is this guy, because he's looking out at us, and Rockwell is extending the table to each one of us. He's including us in this picture. We're all supposed to feel like we are a part of the middle-class American dream. Now, one kind of funny story is that Rockwell had hired his maid to be the model for our matriarch here, and she cooked the turkey. And he said after she did her modeling, they sat down and they ate the turkey. He said that was the only time he's ever eaten a model. So there you have it. And then our last image here is the freedom from fear. And this is the one that always really astounds me, because I think that this one would be a hard concept to try and visualize. But we have a mother and a father tucking their 2 babes into bed at the end of the day. And importantly here, the father is holding a newspaper, and upside down, you might be able to make out the words bombings and horror. So he's reading about what's happening in the rest of the world, and he knows he can tuck his children into bed without worrying about his family's safety and security. Notice that every line, really, from the part in his hair to the architecture to the bent in his arm, is meant to draw your eye to those innocent faces in the bed. So quite an impressive series that he created here. We're going to turn our attention to just a couple of images of heroes at home, because of course Rockwell was stuck at home, and so these were really the stories that he could tell best. He actually painted an image of his local rationing board, believe it or not. He wanted to demystify that whole process for Americans. He went to his rationing board and said, "May I come in and observe for a day and make sketches in a final painting based on this committee?" And they said, "Yes, you may." And he said, "If I do a good job, will you basically give me more rations?" And they said, "No, we will not." So I think he went in with a sort of a bent perspective on them, but he includes himself in the picture. We can see him there observing. He puts in a pretty sort of standard, relatable, middle-aged, middle-class man who is pleading his case to the rations committee here, who are all listening, and we have this little cross-section of the community. Now, I think even more compelling than the finished painting were the sketches that Rockwell created of the different people that he saw at the rationing office. Now, this is the real cross-section of humanity. The woman with 4 kids, we've got a veteran up there with a hole in his shoes. You can almost hear the stories of each one of these characters as he drew them, and your heart goes out to all of them. Now, probably Rockwell's most famous hero at home is this lady here, Rosie the Riveter, and she does put a smile on your face, doesn't she? This is from 1943, and our Rosie here is looking ever so confident, looking down her nose, holding her ham sandwich on the other side of her head. We can see that she's got welding goggles on and even a visor, even a tiny little halo because she's doing saintly work. She's got these big impressive arms. There's her lunchbox, a massive riveting gun here with a hose that winds down and draws our attention to the fact that she, with her penny loafers here, is stomping on Adolf Hitler's biography Mein Kampf. So pretty proud of the work that she's contributing here too. A couple of fun details is that Rockwell still wanted to make Rosie appear feminine. So she is wearing lipstick, and even though she's got these big arms and she's wearing men's clothes, she's got makeup popping out of her pockets here. And this is actually a photograph of Rockwell with the model for Rosie the Riveter. You can see that she is a normally proportioned woman. Apparently he felt really bad for exaggerating her anatomy in this way. But in this case, Rockwell was looking at Michelangelo for inspiration for his Rosie. This is a prophet from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And I mean, by virtue of the fact that this figure is painted, 70 feet off the ground, they have to look massive, they have to look monumental, so that you can see them. But Michelangelo also loved to give his figures a lot of muscles. So Rockwell borrows from Michelangelo in terms of the pose and just the monumentality of the figure. And he's also doing something really impressive here, because for almost the entire history of art, if you see a woman with a halo on her head, she's got a baby in her arms. And Rockwell's completely changes the script and makes this woman so physically impressive. I mean, he was like a feminist before we were really talking about feminism, right? Rosie is impressive in so many ways. He painted her again. Most people don't know about this one. This is called Rosie to the Rescue, and we can see she's kind of dressed in the American flag here. She's literally wearing many hats. I think there's something like 29 different professions that she's holding and carrying. She's moving forward, but she's kind of hunched over by the burden of wearing these different hats. But you can see Rockwell celebrating all the work that women were doing to keep the country running during the war here. All right, so the homecomings. This is when the heartstrings really get pulled. This is the good stuff. All right, one of my favorite homecomings by Norman Rockwell is this one from 1945. And Rockwell does this wonderful thing for some of his pictures. He puts his protagonist so that we see them from behind, and he allows us to project ourselves into that figure's body. So we are looking at him, his family, really, as though it's our family, and we are imagining that it's our homecoming, and we know exactly how it would feel to see our mother with her arms wide open, to have a little brother running down the stairs and the dog flying through the air there. So all of that hits your heart in a really powerful way right off the bat. And then there's like this whole wonderful cast of characters in this neighborhood. You've got the girlfriend waiting around the corner for her chance to say hello, people working on the roof over here, and then just people peeking over the fence or out of windows. Everybody is celebrating the safe return of this young soldier here, even kids up in the trees. There's another way to understand this picture, and that's with the blue stars. So whenever you had a family member who was fighting abroad, you'd get those blue stars. And you notice that there are blue stars in all the windows. There's even a window up above that has 3 blue stars in it. So one person returns home safely. It's like there's hope for everybody to return home safely. Now, Rockwell could have painted this in a nice suburban neighborhood with a white picket fence, right? That would have been a prettier picture. Instead, we've got like trash in the foreground, essentially. Why did he do that? He went to Troy, New York. He found this kind of tenement neighborhood, and he thought, that's what I'm gonna paint. In part because all of these people are living so close to each other that they are involved in each other's lives in a way that maybe you're not if you've got a lot of lawn between you and your neighbor. But telling the story of working class people in an integrated neighborhood was so important to Rockwell. That is what he wanted for his cover. I want to compare this for you to a similar painting illustrator. This is N.C. Wyatt's Homecoming, also from 1945. And you can see that the tone and the feeling of that picture is so different. When you don't have your family and your whole community coming out to celebrate, just have the dog. It's a much more somber picture. All right. Takes us back to our homecoming Marine where we started tonight. And this is probably the most somber picture that Rockwell painted, where we can see a Marine with the Japanese flag here. Up above, there's a poster that says, "Garage Man, a Hero." So here he is home again in his garage. We can just see the bumper of a car right here. And he's surrounded by men, young and old, who are eager to hear his story. What did he do that was so heroic? And he seems pretty hesitant about sharing that story. But notice how people are leaning in here. I love the lighting. It almost looks like a Baroque painting here. All right. Some of the homecomings are just so sweet. They're almost saccharine. Here we almost get the freedom from want and a homecoming together. It's a Thanksgiving cover. It's also KP. It's a soldier who's sitting with his feet up on the rungs of this chair, helping his mom make Thanksgiving dinner, and she's looking at him adoringly. Another soldier who's returned home, and in this case, he has taken off his uniform. He's trying on an old suit. This one's called Imperfect Fit. He's grown up quite a bit since he's been away. This is such a wonderful composition. Notice how Rockwell's using all of these triangles, even the triangles in the architecture of this space, and it sort of emphasizes this feeling of things being an imperfect fit. it's like the space kind of collapsing on him. Another great homecoming picture, this is from December 1945. Rockwell knew he was going to paint this picture as early as like July, I think, and he wanted to paint Union Station in Chicago. He actually went to the people that run the station and said, can you tell me what you do for Christmas decorations? I want to get it just right. And he was such an institution, even at that point, that they said, Mr. Rockwell, whatever you paint, we'll put it up in December. So we can see busy Union Station. We've got Santa raising money here that we see from behind. We see some people with their wreaths and their trees here, but we see a lot of soldiers smooching their girlfriends upon their return home from the war. And the longer you look at it, the more of the canoodling you can spot here. It's pretty wonderful. Reminds us of the classic picture, right? Okay, so as we wrap up, just one or two last images here. This is a picture Rockwell created, I think this is 1946 if I'm remembering correctly, and it's called The Long Shadow of Lincoln. This is Norman Rockwell thinking about what's ahead for the country. This is a pretty incredible image. So Lincoln here is pictured as a sculpture at the top left, and is you can really only see his mouth. Rockwell is painted himself right alongside the sculpture, looking very thoughtful. At the center of the composition is a wounded soldier with a crutch here. I think his leg has actually been amputated. What's his future? What's ahead for him? Well, Rockwell has created like this swirl of energy and activity here that sort of spells the future for America. And it begins with somebody literally reaching down to help others up. We have a teacher teaching students. We have an architect or a builder here, our nuclear family, honoring the dead, people in prayer, and then across the top, I know it's very hard to see, but those are refugees. And for Rockwell, he was very much seeking humanitarian solutions to all of the people that were displaced during the war, so he wanted to include them there. So, I mean, what an ambitious picture, and really not a very well-known picture for Rockwell. So it all wraps up right now because Rockwell was given sort of the ultimate assignment when it came to World War II. The war had ended. It's 1946. It's the July 4th cover of the Saturday Evening Post. What's our punctuation mark on this for the Post for the war? He was tasked with creating an image of the Statue of Liberty. And I have this image here that is not painted by Rockwell, just to show you that the Statue of Liberty was like always on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. So we have a sketch over here on the right with some of Rockwell's initial ideas, because he knew he wanted to do something different. He just didn't want to do a standard representation of the Statue of Liberty. He wanted to tell a story, of course, so he's thinking about all these different people who might be at the base of the statue, looking up at it. Eventually, he gives up on that idea. He actually got in touch with the Statue of Liberty, and he said, do you have pictures of people cleaning the statue? And they said, we don't do that, but we do have people who clean the torch. And that's what gave Rockwell this idea. Can you imagine somebody saying to you, paint the Statue of Liberty, and you just decide to show her curls, her crown, and her arm? That's incredibly innovative. And he wanted to instead tell the story of these five guys up here, you know, hundreds of feet off of the ground. We've got the birds down below them. And what he's emphasized here is just the right thing to emphasize, because now at this point in 1946, America is the leader, and America is leading with freedom, and that's what's represented in this torch here. And he's showing, you know, the humble, everyday American who's involved in the work of keeping that torch going. It's so smart, right? So he also did something that was kind of ahead of his time too. This is 1946, and he decided to include a black man as an equal in that work there. Now this image ended up in the collection of the White House, the finished image, the finished painting. And when they realized that Rockwell was really kind of making a civil rights statement by including that figure there, they reinstalled it over a bust of Martin Luther King Jr. So Rockwell's kind of progressive stances as related to social justice have been sort of newly appreciated, I would say, in the last decade or so. So we wrap up tonight with just some of these big ideas. Rockwell's incredible patriotism, his incredible attention to detail, and his remarkable ability to tell stories through these pictures. I'll end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you have about Rockwell. Thank you.
So apart from, do the Statue of Liberty, like World War II, did the Saturday Evening Post give him specific assignments, or did he come up with the subjects himself?
That's a really good question, and I don't know if I have a satisfying answer to that question. I think he would oftentimes get assignments, and especially early on in his career, he was given a lot of feedback in terms of how to edit those images to make them really pop and stand out on a newsstand. But I would imagine by the time we get to the 1940s, his instincts for this have really been honed, and he's able to do it a little bit better. I think the Saturday Evening Post, out of all of these, is like the only one that stands out in my mind as a specific assignment, and that was a July 4th cover. So maybe there was a mix of that, but I can't be sure. Great question, though.
Thank you. I was wondering if he continued, and did he do anything with Korea or Vietnam that was commentary?
Another great question. He did continue on. He became much more interested in politics by the 1960s, and he consciously separated himself from the Saturday Evening Post so that he could focus more on social, cultural, political issues. Offhand, I'm trying to think. I think that there is at least one Korea picture, maybe, but definitely images that have to do with Vietnam but aren't representations of Vietnam itself. There's one image called The Right to Know, where it just shows all of these people sort of facing the government, and that was supposed to be about Vietnam. He got pretty radical towards the end there. Yeah.
Not a question, a comment. Outstanding presentation.
Thank you.
That was very well done.
I appreciate that, but Norman Rockwell really did all the heavy lifting tonight. I always like to tell people too, if you have comments, questions for me, corrections for me after the fact, you can always get in touch with me at my website, which is iamculturallycurious.com. And I do love to hear from people. And I love if you had an experience. One of the great things about doing these presentations in New England, so many people have met Rockwell. They've had, family members pose for Rockwell. All those stories are out there, and I always love to hear them.
In terms of American painters, how is Rockwell viewed? What are the criticisms of his art?
Right. Oh, criticisms of Rockwell. There are plenty of them. This fine line distinction between illustrator and artist. Illustrators were sort of seen, if there's a hierarchy there, they were certainly seen as less than a fine art artist. So with the example of N.C. Wyeth, he was an illustrator, but his son went on to be a fine art artist. And N.C. Wyeth always wanted to achieve the same thing. For Rockwell, it didn't matter. He was just happy doing what he was doing. He didn't care about that distinction at all. I feel like I've gotten away from the origin of your question, but but he was happy to make these kinds of images, and then ultimately a little bit more interested in editorial policy later on in his life. Yeah. Did that get to did that answer your question, Fran? No. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for your time and attention. I really appreciate it. Oh, did we have one last one? One last one, sorry.
I'll just ask very quickly, did Rockwell have a painting that, that stood out to him, that he loved the most?
That is a wonderful question. Did Rockwell have a painting that he particularly loved? I think I have an answer for you. He actually struggled with depression for some of his life, and one of the reasons was because he always wanted to make a picture that really meant something and really mattered. And by the time it got to the 1960s, I think it was actually his therapist who suggested to him the story of Ruby Bridges. That's a picture to paint. So you might be familiar with his image. It's called The Problem We All Live With, and it's inspired by Ruby Bridges, the little girl who desegregated New Orleans public schools, and she's surrounded by the U.S. Marshals. It's a really powerful image, and I think that was like the image that was in his heart that he wanted to paint. That would have never gotten on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. They had editorial policies against essentially showing black people who weren't in subservient positions. So that's why he left, and that's what he was able to create as a result. Great question. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jane.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
And if I could just have people sit tight for the annual meeting, it'll take us a second to get ready.
Thank you for tuning in to Exeter TV. Exeter TV is the town's public and government access channels, available on Comcast Channels 6 and 22. Channel 6 is your channel. If you have an idea for a program, want to host your own talk show, or submit a film, we're here to get your content on television. On Channel 22, we bring you live and replay coverage of government meetings and other town updates. A third channel, Blue Hawk Media, is operated by SAU 16 and can be found on Channel 8, with all your school sports, events, and meetings. You can watch Exeter TV online at exeternh.tv, Apple TV, and on Roku. Find us on social media for extra content. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell to get notified about live streams and new content. Tune in to our platforms every other Friday to watch the Exeter Bi-Weekly Report, with recaps of recent events, updates from town departments, and messages from nonprofits in your area. If you head to our website, exeternh.tv, we invite you to sign up to our newsletter to receive monthly updates about new content, upcoming meetings, and more. We'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch